Hello, I'm Amira Mohammed Khalid from Group year-FLA. Today I'll be presenting a comparison between The Legacy and I Stand Here Ironing. First of all, the introduction. The Legacy and I Stand Here Ironing were two short fictional stories which were written by two female novelists in the 20th century. The Legacy was scripted by Virginia Woolf, who was a renowned English feminist writer, while I Stand Here Ironing was composed by Tillie Olsen, who was an American feminist author. Their experiences and their social backgrounds were reflected on their exceptional tales. Additionally, both of them were deprived from their educational rights. To illustrate, Virginia had no educational opportunity. Equally, Tillie dropped out of school in the 11th grade. The comprehension of the implicit congruency between the two major female characters of the novellas and the two authors depended on recognizing that Angela and Emily's mother were unknowledgeable. Apart from this, the mental illnesses that Virginia and Tillie suffered from must be taken into consideration in accordance with the circumstances of their generation. Mainly, the common theme of The Legacy and I Stand Here Ironing is gender roles, which was a topic of interest in the 20th century. Virginia Woolf illustrated patriarchy through Gilbert Clarendon, in contrast with Tillie Olsen, who presented matriarchy through Emily's mother. Because of the portrayal of gender roles in British and American literature was distinct, a splendid assessment will be applied throughout the paper. Second, the summary of The Legacy. The Legacy was a short story that was concerned with the demise of Angela Clarendon, who died as a result of stepping off the curb and being hit by a car at Piccadilly in London. She died 6 weeks before the opening of the story and decided to divulge her secrets through the legacy she left Gilbert. Not only did she leave her husband her diary, but also forsook legacies for various people, including her secretary, Cissy Miller. Gilbert was compelled to wait for Cissy to come back in order to give her the pearl brooch Angela bequeathed her. Afterwards, Cissy was grieved by her employer's passing away and offered Gilbert assistance for the sake of Angela. Gilbert's prying constrained him to read the 15 volumes of his wife's diary, which led to his indictment eventually. Yet the writer left the readers with an open-ended resolution and did not unveil what Gilbert did after his epiphany. Third, the analysis of the characters. Angela Clarendon. She was a young married woman whose first year of marriage was successful, but she became lonely due to her husband's negligence and his devotion for his career. Another reason why Angela felt alone was because she was a housewife who had no children and had Cissy as her confidant. Angela was a subservient wife. She asked for her husband's permission to volunteer in the East End with the purpose of helping others. It was obvious that Angela changed during the story by comparing the first volume in which she expressed her love for Gilbert with the 15th one in which B.M. was believed to have asked her to elope. At first, she was a dedicated wife who adored her husband. Then, it was assumed and comprehended that she became the mistress of B.M. Moreover, she was isolated from the real world. Therefore, she despised herself for living such an extravagant life once she heard about the tormenting of the working class, coupled with her passion for little boxes. Also, her suicide implied how she became brave and independent. What is more, she was thoughtful, owing to giving her properties to the ones whom she considered significant. To prove that, she inscribed, "For Cissy Miller, with my love," which clarified how she regarded her parlour maid as her dear friend. Gilbert Clarendon. He was an old-age, aristocratic, prominent politician who married Angela. He got a minor post in the parliament. Still, he aspired to become a prime minister by exceeding his 50s. He was satisfied with not having children and did not complain about it. The fact that he was a dominating husband and a narcissist made him undervalue his wife in addition to castigating her. Gilbert infantilized Angela and taunted her when he asserted that she was eager to learn. He also disclosed that she was ignorant. When he depicted her handwriting, he reported that it resembled a schoolgirl's writing. He underestimated her the minute he wondered if only she had discussed the matter with him, instead of puzzling her poor little head about questions that were too much difficult for her to understand. He believed that the main subject of Angela's life was based on trifles, and he hated the clothes she wore whenever she went to the Whitechapel, for the reason that she dressed modestly. The conceited and obnoxious Gilbert Clarendon only recalled his speech and what he had done. He even skipped the parts where his name was not mentioned in the volumes. In addition, his mind wandered to his future while he was reading his dead wife's diaries. Indeed, he told Sissy after receiving Angela's gift that he hoped she had other clothes upon which a pearl brooch would not look so incongruous. He stated, "There were thousands of Sissy Millers, drab little women in black carrying attaché cases." Since he was an egocentric, he misinterpreted Sissy's proposition of serving him as an unobserved love. Furthermore, his narrow mind misled him. Thus, he supposed that Angela's death was caused by her absent-mindedness. BM. The initials of this character were implemented with the aim of establishing a tone of suspense, as he could not be identified, which was why Gilbert could not know who he was. He recognized him through asking Sissy Miller. BM was the brother of Sissy Miller and the presumed lover of Angela Clarendon. He was a revolutionary who belonged to the lower class. Thus, he loathed the upper class. Despite his hatred towards the aristocrats, he became fond of a noble woman. He was open-minded, considerate, and honest. For instance, he enlightened Angela, who was unsociable and oblivious, so as to discern the plight of the poor. Specifically, he recited that his mother was a charwoman. As a consequence of his mindfulness, Angela became attracted to him and was disgusted of the lavish life she chose. Besides, on account of BM's affection, it was deduced that BM requested Angela's decampment. Her refusal brought about his suicide. Sissy Miller. Sissy was Angela's personal assistant whom she shared with her secrets and her private matters. Owing to her secrecy, Sissy's trustworthiness was entailed. She mourned her brother prior to Angela's killing. To Sissy, Angela was more than an employer. She loved and valued her. Certainly, she wept over the deceased Angela. Undoubtedly, the unique relationship between Angela and Sissy was elucidated by Angela's choice to leave behind her luxurious pearl brooch with a caption showing love. She wore dark professional reserved garments which Gilbert disparaged. Fourth, the comparison between Gilbert and BM. Overall, Gilbert Clarendon was a capitalist. In contrast, BM was a communist, which denoted that two controversial political systems were presented using the characters. On one hand, Gilbert was prejudiced and advocated the supremacy of the upper class, which was noticeable, for he degraded BM by alleging that he was a specimen. On the other hand, BM was unbiased and favored the penurious, which was indicated when he recalled his mother being a charwoman. Whereas BM was a radical, Gilbert was a notorious member of the parliament. Even though Gilbert was unbearable, he was dedicated to his wife and did not have an affair with a paramour. BM was fully aware that Angela was a married woman. However, he committed an adultery. Angela could have been drawn more to Gilbert than BM, provided he had spent further time with her. In other words, Gilbert and BM were an example of antithesis. Fifth, the summary of I Stand Here Ironing. I Stand Here Ironing was a short story that emphasized the role of a young and inexperienced mother in her children's lives, in particular, Emily. Firstly, the events of the narrative began with Emily's mother, who was ironing while having a conversation with an anonymous individual on the phone who was thought to be a social worker. She was asked by the unknown individual to give a detailed description of Emily's childhood since she needed care. Secondly, the mother recollected leaving her daughter with a neighbor to guard her when Emily was 8 months old. Thirdly, she sent her to live with her father's family. Finally, as soon as Emily reached the age of 2, her mother placed her in a daycare. She apprehended that she worked for long hours to the extent of not providing her first child with the emotional support she necessitated. Subsequently, she felt guilty for not being attentive to Emily's difficulties as a child and a teenager. Still, she hoped that Emily would overcome them. The author did not focus on the mother's regret. She elaborated Emily's struggling and her talents, as well as contrasting her sister Susan. Namely, the story ended by the mother enumerating the reasons why Emily had an astounding infanthood. To be precise, she affirmed the social worker that Emily would perceive herself as an important creation. Sixth, the analysis of the characters. The narrator. The narrator of the tale was nearly a 40-year-old single mother who underwent impoverishment. She had to find a job at an early age with the purpose of fulfilling her children's financial and alimentary needs. As her former husband abandoned her, she started to look for a job. Consequently, she became married once again, but she paid attention to her newborn daughter, Susan. Being a strong, independent woman, she was obliged to bear the responsibility of her children by herself. When the social worker called Emily's mother, she remembered what Emily had encountered and was overwhelmed by remorse. She could not match the perfect motherhood standards by virtue of being absorbed in her career. Accordingly, the undesired surroundings backfired on Emily. Equally important, the mother established an attitude of defeat. She was helpless about Emily's hardships. She was cognizant that she could not reverse what had happened in the past. Hence, she made amends for the other youngsters instead of Emily. Lastly, she anticipated that Emily would deem herself as a resilient, precious girl. Emily was the eldest sister among her siblings. She was a 19-year-old girl who was kept in a sanatorium on the grounds that she was afflicted with tuberculosis at some point in her life. Emily was a solitary adolescent girl whose health conditions prevented her from attending school. On account of Emily's illness, she was categorized as a slow learner by her class fellows. She combated a daunting infancy as she moved frequently to numerous fosterers and child carers. Regardless of her jolly nature and good-looking features, throughout her early years of babyhood, Emily's facial appearance transformed in her teenage years. Of course, she was conscious of her skin's complexion. For instance, she was not poised owing to the previous factors. Then, she surpassed her pain. She noticed her capabilities, which included acting and amusing others. Notably, she could not develop her talents given that she was not provided with the emotional and financial motivations which were essential to her. In the end, she returned to her home and prepared a meal to herself. Susan was Emily's younger sister. She was 14 years old. She was egoistic, for she repeated Emily's jokes with the intention of impressing the audience and seeking their attention. Susan's beautiful appearance contributed to her self-assurance. For example, she was blonde, chubby, and curly-haired. Obviously, Susan was not subjected to complications like her sister Emily, such as tuberculosis. Susan was communicative and more sociable than her sister, which stemmed from the environment she enjoyed. That is, Susan availed of the qualities that she was given, yet she was an awful sister. Emily's father and stepfather. Emily's father flew as he could not tolerate the pennilessness of the family. Her stepfather gave an impression of being a pathetic person who did not alter the family's conditions. So her mother continued ironing clothes to earn money. Generally, Emily's father and stepfather were barely cited in the narrative, which highlighted the triviality of their roles. Seventh, comparison between Emily and Susan. The two adolescent girls, Emily and Susan, were half-sisters. Unlike Emily, Susan was less thoughtful. While Susan retold Emily's jests, Emily endeavored to accomplish her dreams, which meant she was sturdy. Although Susan was companionable, she could not be as imaginative as her elder sister. The two sisters represented the ideology of contradiction. Eighth, the comparison between Angela and Emily's mother. Angela and Emily's mother embodied the following themes: juvenescence, independence, self-perception, marriage, and gender inequality. Both of them were wedded and were exposed to gender discrimination by their spouses. In the case of Angela, she was a young woman who espoused a 50-year-old official. Similarly, Emily's mother was a wife who gave birth to her first baby in such a young age. Likewise, Angela and the mother of Emily were uneducated and attempted to resist their statuses. Angela's self-sufficiency lied in her self-murder, while the mother's self-reliance was illuminated by her unceasing pursuit so as to get an occupation. Angela's self-percept was modified in the end of the story. Therefore, her principles revolutionized. Clearly, Emily's mother blamed herself for not being able to meet the needs of her daughter, even though she was a victim of the unsought conditions. She was in conflict with herself because she could not view herself as a valuable mother. Besides, Angela was rich, compared to Emily's mother, who was poor. Despite Angela's high living standards, she understood the worries of the penniless. On the other hand, Emily's mother was indigent. On the whole, Angela and Emily's mother were targets of the inequity because of their husbands' inadequate cooperation. Last, conclusion. Overall, Virginia Woolf and Tilly Olsen personified the theme of polarity using their significant characters, Gilbert and BM, as well as Emily and Susan respectively. Based on the preceding analyses and evaluations, it would seem that the objective of each of the short stories was to shed light on the gender unfairness accompanied by the alluded themes. It could be suggested that their backgrounds throughout the period of the Great Depression stimulated them to compile their remarkable writings. That's all, and thank you for watching.